Welcome to Liberty in America, Past, Present, and Future with Dr. Bill Chobe. Doc is a historian and a reenactor. On this show, you'll hear his thoughts about our personal liberties from their earliest recorded beginnings. You'll also be transported back to the 1750s to relive the life of Colonel George Washington and his adventures during the French and Indian War. Let's get started. Here's Dr. Bill Chobe.
Hello there. I'm Dr. Bill Chobe. This is my very first podcast, and I'm here to talk about my book, Liberty in America, Past, Present, and Future. And the idea of this book is to discuss basically what it is to be an American and where we're going with in our country and why we need to preserve what we've been given, freedoms. This was not my first selection of how to run my life. I had originally wanted to be a dentist, and I studied many years to make that possible. But while I was in college, I developed a side interest in politics and history, American history particularly. But it was just a side interest. My bachelor's degree was in natural sciences. I had a minor in what we call environmental and field biology, which is a precursor to what we call environmental science today. And I participated in the very first Earth Day. And one of the things that we had to do for our class was to write a pamphlet on how to buy things that are ecologically sound. And what we chose to do was to promote the idea that if you bought beer in kegs, it was better than buying them in cans. So you can only imagine. That was at the very beginning of all this talk about environmentalism. But I do have a minor in environmental sciences and with an overall degree in natural sciences. Nonetheless, I went to dental school, and afterwards I spent 2 years at a hospital in New York City as a resident and the chief resident. I saw a lot of surgery, I saw a lot of trauma, I saw different kinds of people from all different walks of life, because New York is a metropolitan area that is really a world city. And those experiences prepared me to finally get out into the world and to turn all of my educational investments into a living. It wasn't soon after that I found that because my training was different than most, that I became a topic of obsessions of jealous people who didn't like the fact that I was crossing over turf lines. And it was totally within our realm, within the power of our license of my profession. It's just that they didn't like this, anybody coming into their turf. Nonetheless, turned into a turf war, and the turf war turned into politics. And before I know it, I was being alleged of misleading the public by placing an advertisement with my degree, DMD, dental medicine doctor, among MDs, which is what was recommended to me by the advertising salesman. And the idea was that I was pretending that I was an MD instead of a DMD, which I wasn't, but it was. Anyhow, the State Board of Dentistry decided that they were going to smear me with it, and they did. They smeared my name all over the state using the professional publications, and they really wanted to nip it at the bud that advertising was something that wouldn't be tolerated in dentistry. Well, it ruined me. Within 3 months, my business disappeared, and I lost everything I owned, and along with other personal things that were happening. My brother was very sick with cancer, eventually died, and other family problems, but I went back to school. I went to Virginia Polytechnic Institute for the Center of Public Administration and received the very first Master in Public Administration from VPI. And my thesis was licensure in the dental market, and it was instrumental in changing the law in Virginia for reciprocity. But in Pennsylvania, the idea that dentists would advertise was considered to be voodoo, and so I made efforts through the Federal Trade Commission that they sat on these guys, and eventually through the governor's office. And as a result, advertising became commonplace in all the health professions in Pennsylvania. So even though it was, you get handed lemons, you try to make lemonade out of them. And with that Master's in Public Administration, I did a whole number of things with my consulting work. I became a dental expert in malpractice cases and in issues of peer review of different policies, traveled to 13 states, inspecting offices, And in that course of that time, I got to stop at many of the American Revolutionary War memorials and battlegrounds, museums, etc. And I was looking for America, looking for what it was that started this, because again, that interest back in college of American history was starting to emerge for me. And one day I was in Philadelphia, near the Pennsylvania State House, where the Constitution was signed. And lo and behold, on a bench there on the sidewalk sat Ben Franklin. I sat down and talked to him for about an hour, and I was just so impressed that he stayed within character for all that time, and he was so knowledgeable about all the things about the founding of our country, the Liberty Bell, etc., that I decided that one day I wanted to do that. So when I returned back to Western Pennsylvania, I decided to join the Historical Society, and I took on the character of General Arthur St. Clair. As it turned out, I had a uniform made, and started going to parades and things. And I found people were calling me George. I said, George? I'm not George. No, I'm Arthur St. Clair. No, you're George. I said, well, maybe I am. So I started to research George Washington, who spent a lot of time in Western Pennsylvania as a young man, and was very instrumental in the development of our country from this part of the world. He, in fact, was the one that was blamed for starting the French and Indian War, which eventually became the First World War between the British and the French and so many other countries around the world. But I started to study about this man and the different things that he had done, and then being dressed in his attire or replicas of his uniform, I would retell the story to different groups, kids, school-age kids, or to civic groups, etc. And as time went on, I became more and more impressed of just the character of this fellow, and of course the character of all the Revolutionary War figures of the Founding Fathers and women, that they lived their character, and they lived these things, and it wasn't just some wild idea about being free. They lived it. And with that kind of understanding of who they were, I began to see that what had happened to this country was because we've gotten away from the kind of character that these men had. Now, when I grew up at a time in the 50s and 60s where this country was safe, now, mind you, our parents had gone through a depression, had gone through the Second World War, some of them the First World War. They hated war. They hated the death and destruction of it, and they sought to raise families that were safe and happy. And we were the benefactors. The baby boomers were the benefactors of the attitudes of our parents, or the desires to make this a safe and wonderful place to grow up. We didn't have to worry about people being kidnapped or whatever. We'd stay out until the street lights came on, and we'd run around on our bicycles without helmets on. And we did all kinds of things ran down through the woods playing with frogs and fish and everything else. And we had our scuffles with our friends, and we always got back together again. It was a wonderful time to be alive. Literally, it's sort of a Little Rascals type of upbringing. Kids all over the place, baseball in the front yard, or capture the flag, or whatever have you. It was a great place to live. And it's because the values, the American values that were inculcated by our founding fathers, made those days possible. So as I got older, and I saw that this wasn't the same world. This something had dramatically happened. And through the 70s and the 80s, it was not the same country that I knew when I grew up. And that was discouraging, raising my kids and trying to give them the kinds of things and opportunities that I had was not as easy as it had been when we were young. I mean, if you could just imagine, when we were kids, we got polio shots, because if you got polio, you ended up in an iron lung, which meant that you had to live in basically a casket with your head sticking out in order to breathe. And it was a very real thing, and they didn't have antibiotics. You didn't just go and get, a shot the way we do today, or get pills today if you got a sore throat or whatever have you. People died at different ages because sickness and death was real. But as advances in medicine came along, that became less of a concern. And with that, the threat of dying, or the threat of being very sick, until only recently with COVID, was basically far beyond anybody's mind and their imagination. So what I found was that through all this experience in dealing with the State Board of Dentistry and these advertising, this reprimand that haunted my career, I decided to pour my passions and anger If I hadn't, I would have hurt somebody, and I just wasn't going to screw up my life hurting somebody because I was hurting. And I poured my passion and studies into creating this book, and I got involved with public office. I ran for Congress a number of times. Although I didn't succeed, I participated. And many people laughed at me and thought that I was foolish, but I felt that there was a need to do that. It was part of the passion in me that I needed to feel that passion, just to feel like I've done something, and contributed something. And I believe I did. Those experiences led to the writing of my book. In this book, I go back to the get-go as to what is freedom, what is liberty about, where did it come from, where is it going? How did it go from strong men, basically, ordering people or pounding people into submission to their will, to where there was a rule of law, to where there was freedom of speech, to where there was an opportunity to create a government by the will of the people, and to sustain that government by the will of the people. These things didn't happen in a flash and all at one time. It took thousands of years to emerge. And so what we have here in America is something that's so unique in the history of the world that it's something that I see slipping away due to political correctness or wokeness. And I would encourage the reader to take the time to read my book and go through the steps that I did to understand where we are, how we got to where we are, and what we need to do to keep that hope and that torch alive, the torch of freedom. I'll leave you with a little teaser. When might is right, the people are in bondage. When I say might, I mean like a strong man. A strong man beats you over the head if you don't do what they tell you. You're in bondage to them. When right is might, when justice, when fairness and good things are might, through just laws, people are free. But when right becomes wrong, there's chaos. And we're seeing that today in our cities, in our lives. And it will remain that way one of two ways. Might can come back to be right, or right can come back to be might. It's our choice. But if we don't do something to make right become might again, it will be might, will be right, and we will live in bondage even greater than ever before in this country. So that's my teaser, my trailer for next time. Please come back, and thanks for taking the time to listen to me, and good evening.